Well, it's great to be with you guys. Looking forward to this particular topic. Those of you that have tuned in hoping for a knockdown, drag-out debate between which is better, organic or conventional fertility management, you're going to be disappointed because I'm not going to take it from that particular point of view. But we are going to talk about the relative advantages, disadvantages, concerns, limitations, and things on that, and look at ways that we can use both organic and conventional sources as a complete toolbox in nutrient management as we go along. So with that, let's get started. I want to start with kind of a big overview to kind of set the background, the stage, as it were, for some of the points I'll be making in this. And if we look at soil development in the natural environment, there's a number of different factors that go into making a soil a soil. Obviously, you have the parent material, the rock, the sand, and so forth that accumulates at the soil surface and then interacts with time as it weathers and breaks down, or as it accumulates or not in various settings in the landscape due to topography, as climate, heating, cooling, wetting, drying, and so forth, that has its effect. And then the living part of our environment interacting with it, digging through it, leaving its residues and tissues and other things in place, and the cycling and breakdown of those all throughout the time affect the character of our soil. It's interesting to me when it comes to traditional soil fertility management that we often ignore this particular rather important soil forming factor. And I'm going to continue to refer back to that as we look at this management scheme of using multiple sources and possibilities in managing fertility. Let's take a look at another big picture item. These are the nutrients that typically we know are confirmed plant, essential plant nutrients, meaning it's missing any one of them, regardless if it's used in really tiny quantities. If it's missing any one, the plant can't complete its life cycle. The ones that we typically see that are in need for management in Utah soils are those that are in yellow here: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, to a minimal amount, sulfur, zinc, and iron. But there's all of these that we see that are important nutrients. Oxygen, hydrogen, and carbon, of course, come from air and water. All of the others come through some method of cycling, whether it be organic or inorganic additions through our soil system. So the soil is going to figure very prominently in proper nutrition as the plant seeks for these particular elements to live. If we look at, and this may be one of the reasons why oftentimes we ignore the living part of the soil, is that if we took it any volume of soil material, you'll notice that about half of it is pore space. It can be filled with air and water to one extent or another, depending on the climatic conditions. But most of the solid material that's there is mineral material. So the sand, the silt, the clay, in some cases pea gravel, rock, and other things that are mixed in there. About a full half of it is pretty close to that made up of mineral matter, and then a small amount of organic matter mixed in. So oftentimes this small fraction of organic material in the mix seems to get ignored, and we don't understand the importance of it. In Utah, we have 5%, as it says here, is an average over the entire continental US. In Utah, we have much less to deal with, but it's still critically important in the performance of the soil. And the reason that is that soil structure, or the development of stable aggregates that allow for optimal infiltration and aeration and things of soil systems, is dependent upon the bridging of the mineral material, the sand, the silt, the clay, with these organic matter breakdown products that then glue them together in stable aggregates, forming large groupings that allow for large pores in between to increase the aeration and infiltration capacity of that soil. In fact, when we talk about soil health and productivity and sustainability of that productivity over time, soil structure turns out to be the single best indicator of soil health. It's the integrator of all the things that are going on within a soil, indicating that the soil has enough organic matter there, that's being cycled properly by the microbial community that's there in the soil. The breakdown products are helping to form and stabilize that structure in the soil and keeping that performing at optimal levels. So with that as kind of an introduction, let's go ahead and introduce this topic in a way maybe that you hadn't anticipated. It's not a fight between whether organic or inorganic sources are better. In fact, as it turns out, plants are fairly non-sourcist in the vernacular of the day. They don't discriminate between whether or not a particular element comes available through the cycling of an organic matter source or from an inorganic application. But there are trade-offs on the use of these different sources, and that's the way I wanted to approach this. So I want to call it a toolbox concept or a toolbox approach, where we look at the different sources and we look at the limitations and the advantages of each and the important things that they contribute to the real productivity of the system, and use them as much as we can together in a complete toolbox. If we look at organic sources, those are providing all of the needed nutrients as those materials break down, but they're very low in nutrient content compared to inorganic sources. They're much slower to release those nutrients as that material breaks down. And in fact, really only a fraction typically of what's available in those organic sources is made available in any given year of application. However, advantages, they are organic matter sources, which are carbon sources, food sources, for the living fraction of the soil, the microbes that are there and that are doing this cycling and the creation of stable aggregates and really keeping the soil sustainably productive over time. So it helps maintain soil structure. And if you are managing in a certified production setting, these really may be your only options to provide the nutrients that you need. And we'll talk about that here as we go along. Inorganic sources are high concentrations, sources of the needed nutrients, much faster release. In fact, they'll be complete release upon application typically. They have a guaranteed nutrient content, and so they can be used to target when and where exactly we need those nutrients in any given setting. So it gives us some flexibility in much smaller quantities to apply the needed nutrient requirements of the plants. So let's take a look at the sources, and we'll talk about these in a fair amount of detail and look at the nuances with respect to what we get from them. All of our inorganic fertilizers are soluble mineral salts of the nutrient elements. They really have no organic matter per se in them that provides the soil structure building blocks, the food for the microbes and things like that. They strictly will, as they dissolve, provide the specific nutrients contained within their chemical structure. Organic fertilizers, on the other hand, coming from manures or composts or any plant or animal byproducts, are mostly organic material. They were once living tissues. And so as they break down, they not only release the nutrients, but they provide carbon source for the microbes. They provide the building blocks for soil structure and other things that we just don't get from the inorganic sources of nutrients. Other traditional forms of organic sources of nutrients would be living plants growing in the system, green manures and so forth that are, like in the case of legumes, helping to fix nitrogen in symbiosis with soil bacteria. And applying organic materials with their root tissues as they bloom and wane within the soil profile, leaving those residues behind and allowing for those to not only cycle nutrients, but also help build soil structure and open the soils up. With those as kind of the general differences between the sources, let's look at specific sources within each of these categories. Inorganic fertilizers, the soluble salts of the nutrient elements, are guaranteed analysis materials. If it calls itself a fertilizer, it must be a guaranteed analysis material. And so you'll find expressed on those sources three primary numbers referring to the percent nitrogen, percent phosphate, and percent potassium oxide in that order on the bag or the container that the source comes in. There's a number of different formulations and variations of these, supplying multiple levels of each of those nutrients, or just a single nutrient, as in the case of ammonium nitrate, giving just nitrogen, or urea, just nitrogen, those kinds of things. So we can mix and match these sources to then target very specifically the nutrient needs of the plant as determined by soil testing or annual estimates of need in some form or another. Other things also are included typically in these inorganic sources. And so you need to pay attention to some of the fine print on these, because they may include additional secondary nutrients, such as sulfur or iron or other things that are also guaranteed analysis materials, but they're not the primary NPK designations on the bag. So you got to look at them and see if those are included and whether or not you actually need them or you don't. Other properties might be some kind of a slow release polymer coating to help meter out the nutrient as it dissolves over time and keep it a little bit more available longer. Or things like added pesticides, whether they be herbicides for weed control or insecticides for pest control and things like that. So pay attention to the fine print on those, because you want to know what's coming with the material you're adding, because it may or may not be needed and it costs money to do so. I do make a note here on the slow release materials. There is an increasing concern with those for persistence of microplastics. These are polymer coatings that are fairly persistent in the environment. And so when I was on sabbatical this last year in the Midwest, particularly in Wisconsin and Minnesota, there were legislation proposed to limit the use of slow release polymer coated materials because of the concern over microplastics. So keep that in mind as you look for these, to be using them or not. So the best way to select a fertilizer is determine what nutrients you actually need. I talked to my crops class this morning about playing darts in the dark. If you know kind of the general direction of the target, at least sometimes you can hit it if you're in the dark. But being able to see the target is a whole lot easier to hit the target. You may not be great at darts, but at least if you can see it, you're more likely to hit it. And that's what a soil test provides. It provides at least a clear picture of the target that we're shooting for. And then we can mix and match the ratio of the nutrients that we need from inorganic and organic sources, as it turns out, to supply what we need. Do we need a complete fertilizer? We just need one of the nutrients over another, et cetera. Do you need the extras that are in it? Do you need the extra sulfur, or do you need the pesticide that might be included? Those cost money in addition to the fertilizer. And so you really ought to base your selection of a fertilizer on the cost per unit nutrient or additive that you need from that material. Because they're guaranteed analysis materials, these are inorganic fertilizers, they are carefully tested with standard tests that then the stated amount of nutrient is provided regardless of its formulation. No one is better at delivering any given amount of a nutrient than another. And so base your cost or base your expenditures on the cost per unit nutrient that you actually need. Also consider that most established landscapes need annual nitrogen regardless of soil test. And so we're going to probably have to apply to a standard need for any given plant that you're growing, crop, pasture grass, whatever it might be. And a few will need other nutrients. A lot of times we don't need a lot of phosphorus or potassium. And so pay attention to the fact that soil tests can be very helpful in determining or weeding out what nutrients you don't need. One of the things I always caution with inorganic fertilizers is because they are the soluble salts of the nutrient elements. Applied in excess, they can cause additional salt buildup in your soils, which will eventually or can restrict water uptake, nutrient uptake, and other things by the plant as we overwhelm the system with dissolved salts in the soil solution. So pay attention to that as well. Let's switch now to the organic sources and take a look at them and see how some of the nuances in their formulation and release of nutrients might serve as a companion in some way to our fertility management process. Organic nutrient sources are much lower in nutrient concentration or content. A good example for a typical yard waste compost would be something of like a 2-1-2, referring back to the guaranteed analysis on a fertilizer. So 2% nitrogen, 1% phosphate, 2% potassium oxide. So really low compared to, say, urea, which was 46% nitrogen. However, despite that, these are fantastic sources of organic matter. All of them, in one way or another, are going to provide breakdown products that will feed the microbial population, will help build soil structure over time, and be an important annual application vehicle for the needed organic matter in our soils to maintain good structure and soil health. If I'm not managing for certified organic production, then I can oftentimes use organic and inorganic sources in concert with one another to fill in the gaps of the needed levels of nutrients that are required for a given production setting. Looking at the traditional, what I call the traditional group of organic sources, these would be the fresh and composted animal manures, bone and blood meals, green manures, what we talked about, growing living plants that can help, like the legumes, with sequestering nitrogen in the soil profile. It can be used by plants in rotation and so forth. There are also treated municipal sludges, food processing waste, and other things that we kind of lump into the category of biosolids. One caution there with these materials is that they are not recommended for vegetable production because they can carry pathogens and things like that that we don't want on edible portions of materials in the human diet, but they can be okay for use on pastures. Some of the non-traditional sources, however, also can be used and becoming much more readily available for in bulk or in small quantities for even home gardening and other things. So if we take a look at those, where we looked at maybe composts in the previous one of only being about 2% nitrogen and 2% phosphorus and potassium, these non-traditional sources can be much higher in those nutrients. Kelp and kelp products, seaweed sources and things like that, fish emulsions, fish processing byproducts from the Pacific Northwest. I've used actually in organic pastures for organic milk production here in Cache Valley. They can be as high as 5% nitrogen, which helps get needed nutrients into the soil at much smaller volumes of material. Alfalfa meal, cottonseed meal, soybean meal, some of those can be as high as 10% nitrogen. So now we're starting to approach maybe some of the inorganic nutrient source levels for particularly nitrogen, which we need on an annual basis anyway. Bird guanos, blood meals, fish meal, those kinds of things can be as high as 15%. And there's even some which are considered certified organic that are mined materials like sodium nitrate that can be much higher than even 15% nitrogen content. And so in these levels here, these last two categories, we're starting to approach maybe some of those that can be used at much higher nutrient concentrations. But keep in mind that because they are organic sources and they do need to be broken down in order to release those nutrients, that oftentimes only a fraction of what's contained in them in a total nutrient content sense will be released in the first year after application. So we'll go through an exercise here where we look at calculating the need for a given source compared between organic and inorganic materials. So as we get closer to wrapping up here, here's some guiding principles in these. Organic matter additions are, again, the single most effective amendment in improving soil quality. So we must apply organic materials, regardless of whether we're using inorganic or organic fertilizers. We've got to put organic matter into the system every year annually in order to maintain tilth and structure and nutrient retention and water retention and stability of aggregates and things like that. So look for incorporating always some organic matter addition into your fertility management system. Soils almost never get enough organic matter, especially in arid areas. We just can't produce enough plant tissue over time to really increase it readily without external application. If we look at the stability of soil structure, it takes a long time in an undisturbed perennial planting for structure to be fully developed. We're talking about 4 to 5 years. And so it takes a long time. It's not a one and done thing. You're going to have to continually apply organic matter to build that up over time. But if we stop applying organic matter and we continue to apply just inorganic materials and intensely till, then the half-life of soil structure breakdown is just a few months. And so it takes a long time to build, but it takes very little time to destroy. And I relate this to how hard it is for me to lose weight. You know, I can exercise and I can eat right and I can do that for months and I lose a few pounds, and then it seems like a holiday like President's Day shows up and it's all back again in mere days. So it's one of those kinds of things. Some additional guiding principles. With organic matter, more is better, at least within the limitations of handling and some of the additional limitations that can come in with an organic matter source, such as the following. We have some of those nutrients that could be really, really high content-wise. Phosphorus, for instance, in dairy manures, raw dairy manures can be so high that we would find that phosphorus application is the limiting factor. We can only apply at the level that is actually needed for phosphorus because we want to prevent the off-site movement of phosphates into surface waters and things that can cause environmental issues. Sometimes they're high in salt content. Sometimes they're high in weed and seed content if they're not fully composted. High woody materials, mill waste and sawdust and some of those kinds of things, which we often can apply. They're good organic matter sources, are so high in carbon that they'll cause nitrogen immobilization in the soil and prevent nitrogen uptake by the plants that are growing there. So we have to watch out for that. And then there's other biotoxins. I talk about black walnut, cedar wood residues that have both herbicidal and insecticidal properties. In final kind of conclusion with this, if we look at these two sources and we manage them within the limitations that I've described, we can use them in concert with each other to help meet the needs of whatever we're growing for the nutrients that are required. So I've just got a really general example here. If we categorize nitrogen need, for instance, among various plantings, different kinds of plantings, we're going to look at focus on kind of the medium area here. This would be things like most of our vegetables that we'd be growing in a garden setting or producing in a small farm setting. Most of our ornamentals and landscape plants and things like that will be in this category, requiring anywhere from 2 to 4 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet on an annual basis. If we take the midpoint of that as 3 pounds of need per 1,000 square feet, and we take a traditional compost, which might be, as we mentioned, about 2% nitrogen, it would require 150 pounds of compost dry to apply that 3 pounds of nitrogen that's needed. So you can see these require quite a bit of material to supply the needed level of nutrient. And that would be on a dry weight basis. Most of our materials have some moisture content. So typically around 35% moisture content would mean that we would apply about 230 pounds of standard compost per 1,000 square feet to supply 3 pounds of nitrogen. But then we also mentioned that it has to break down in order to release that. And so only about a fourth of it, about a quarter of it, is available in the first year of application, which means we multiply 230 pounds times 4, giving us somewhere between 900 to 1,000 pounds of compost at normal moisture contents that would be needed to incorporate to supply the 3 pounds of nitrogen that vegetable garden might need. That's a considerable amount when we're talking about what's coming in. We do get the organic matter application. That's great. That's important. But where we're not managing for certified organic, we may want to combine that with inorganic sources to help fill in a little bit of the gap of total need so that we can reduce maybe the amount that we're applying from an organic matter source. So in the inorganic material example, if we were using urea at 46% nitrogen, that would only require about 6 pounds of urea spread out over 1,000 square feet. So we can deliver the nutrient in a very targeted, very immediately available form very quickly with very little material from an inorganic fertility source compared to an organic matter source there. But in concert with each other, again, we want to combine sources when it's possible to meet plant needs. We don't want to forget the living part of the soil that is needing to be fed a carbon source in order for it to continue to function, to continue to cycle nutrients, to improve the availability of nutrients over time, and to keep soil health always improving, at least maintained in our soil systems. So in doing so, when we're combining these, consider the limitations that I mentioned and the concerns as you view each source. And let's use all of the tools available to us in the best efficient way possible. So with that, I'll take a couple of questions if I've got time. Otherwise, maybe Sheridan, you can pass along whatever might be in the Q&A.
Yeah, so you've got a couple questions there. An interesting one here. What are your feelings on biochar as far as benefits and use?
Awesome. Biochar is interesting. Biochar is, we've actually sped up the decomposition product or process from an organic product by partially oxidizing it or burning it. So we're left with a residue that's had a lot of the readily decomposable organic materials burned off. So we're left with kind of a skeleton of those. And what we found out with that material is it oftentimes can be helpful in nutrient retention and water retention, as it has very sorptive qualities, but it doesn't really break down extensively to provide the building blocks for soil structure and the food for the microbes and things like that. So it can help. It is organic matter. It does improve nutrient and water retention in many cases, but it's not really in that category of the organic materials that provide building blocks for soil structure and soil health over time.